Reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
Fred, when you were my colleague at George Mason University some time ago, we never had the opportunity to talk about environmental issues, but environmental issues are taking a more and more important role in our society, and they're consuming more and more national resources. And I'm wondering whether we're going about it the right way. There are a lot of indications that our federal policy or state and local policy can stand some improvements, and I'm wondering, do you share that concern with me?
Yes, I do. It's an important issue, of course. Important because the scale of, as you indicated, the scale of resources that are now being spent on environmental improvement is really quite large. The latest numbers are $150 billion a year. This is not, to be sure, the federal budget. These are resources or monies spent by individuals and by firms, by companies, who then pass the cost on to individuals. So it's just like a tax.
And then also just extra effort, because I have to kind of separate my my bottles and the glass and newspaper from the rest of the, which is not included in that cost that you're mentioning.
And many things that are not included. We might want to just talk about that for just a minute to nail that point down. $150 billion a year works out to about $1,500 a year per household. That's quite a large tax. And that is just the direct expenditure in terms of higher prices for all sorts of things like food and clothing and shelter and transportation. So it takes away disposable income from that household. Money that they could spend in other ways, including taking care of their health and taking care of themselves in a better way. That's a serious issue.
Yeah, and some of the environmental regulations, they don't seem to be worth it. I understand with the environmental regulations controlling the use of formaldehyde, that it might come to hundreds of billions of dollars per life saved. That is, society is spending that amount of money per life saved. And you say, well, look, we're spending that kind of money per life saved for formaldehyde. Well, how many more lives could be saved if we diverted those resources to kidney dialysis machines or something else along those lines? So in that sense, it indeed may be a misallocation of resources.
That's absolutely true. And I think it has to do with the fact that we have, in the federal government, agencies that look at things from a fairly narrow point of view. You have a person, let's say in the Environmental Protection Agency, whose job it is to look at chemicals. And he just worries about chemicals. He doesn't worry about whether these funds had better be spent on, let's say, vaccinations for children to protect them from diseases, or on better health care, or whatever. But you're absolutely right, there's no overall view of comparing these various risks that we experience in our daily lives to make sure that the monies we spend are properly allocated.
And well, you've written a lot on environmental issues. Are Americans being told the truth about these issues, or are we being unnecessarily alarmed? And if so, could you give some examples of those?
There are plenty of examples, and there's a reason why these alarms exist, and that is because they're fairly narrow parochial interests in society. People who want to have a particular problem taken care of, and the way they do this, of course, is to, well, you well know this, you've written about this so many times, is to blow this up out of proportion. we use the word to hype it. They hype it.
Yeah.
And you find, the hype of this year might be global warming. A couple of years ago, it was acid rain. A few years back, it was urban smog, and so on. Every year there's a new environmental issue which is being taken advantage of. You might want to think about what it'll be next year. What's your guess?
Yeah, we had the year before last, we had the big Alar hoax, which imposed millions and millions of dollars of losses in the apple tree, and Alar is the chemical that's used to prevent apples from dropping prematurely and to kind of preserve the apples. And now we come to find out that that a person, a 40-pound boy or 40-pound child would have to eat 1,000 apples for the rest of his life to get the same dosage of Alar that caused the cancer in mice.
Yes. This is, I think, is used. This type of reasoning is used for many other chemicals. It's imagined that a person will consume for 70 years the full dose of some fantastic amount, and then you compare that to a dose that makes a rat sick.
Yes.
It just makes no sense.
Yeah.
So from a scientific point of view, one cannot justify most of the things that are being done today. And that's very sad, because one would like to see science used properly to evaluate the different kinds of risks. And I'm afraid that science is not being used properly. Sometimes it is misused. Very often it's just ignored.
Yeah, well, the average person listening to us talking, they might say, well, why? I mean, how can they get away with it? I mean, how is this done? Why aren't there congressional investigations other than just two guys like you and I?
I think that there are people who are becoming wise to this. Your writings, of course, have alerted many people. I've written about the scientific aspects, and I think it's produced some results. We find now that more and more journalists are becoming informed about these matters, now asking the right questions, which is, are these expenditures doing us any good? How do we know that the money we spend is doing us some good?
Yeah. And I guess one of the reasons why is that journalists have been embarrassed as a result of their just accepting on face value what many environmental organizations are telling them. They find the embarrassment of the dioxin scare that led to the evacuation of Times Beach in Missouri.
I'm sure we could give many examples now, going back, I think, all the way
to Love Canal, maybe.
Or even further, to the banning of DDT. I recall that the DDT was banned by the decision of a single individual who simply ignored the scientific evidence that was available to him, feeling that public opinion was such that the banning made political sense. So that's what was done.
And that policy is not only bad, it's you could call it almost criminal, because I understand that malaria had almost been eliminated worldwide through the use of DDT, but after its ban, that you're starting to see malaria break out again in many of the countries and leading to the deaths of many people.
Yes, I had a personal experience in this respect. A young woman who worked for me, a college student, went overseas to do volunteer work and died of malaria. And it's just shocking to think that in this day and age, people who you would think would have access to health care would die of malaria. But the problem is that the mosquitoes that carry the disease are still around and not being fought by the means that we have. We sort of can't fight them with two hands tied behind our backs.
That's right. And DDT was a relatively cheap pesticide.
Very cheap and very effective.
And very effective. And the substitutes for DDT are maybe not as effective and much more expensive. And so poor countries around the world, they can't afford to buy these substitutes that, Americans can afford to buy, but they can't buy. And so
by the way, the mosquito problem exists in the United States too, and we may be having problems with encephalitis. I've been reading about that. I'm not a medical expert, but it worries me that encephalitis is still rampant in parts of the United States. And after these floods that are taking place in the Midwest, that's a great boon for the mosquito population, I can assure you.
That's right.
They're going to thrive out there.
Well, there are some gurus of the environmentalist movement that are still given respect by some people, such as Paul Ehrlich, Rachel Carson, and some others. And it seems like we don't go back to their predictions that they made in 1962 or 1970 and say, well, have their predictions come true? We just continue to listen to them, and tell me whether I'm correct or not. But people like Paul Ehrlich, Paul is his first name, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Paul Ehrlich. He made predictions about worldwide famines by the 1990s or 1980s.
Oh, no, earlier. No, in the mid-70s.
In mid-70s.
In the mid-70s, yes. And he also had a cancer epidemic in the United States that would wipe out between 50 and 100 million people. And he had the oceans dying by 1980 and had us running out of resources by 1990. As of now, we should have no more oil left in the world. I just reviewed an excellent book by a journalist, Ron Bailey, called Eco-Scam, and I would strongly recommend it to everyone.
Is that a publication of the Cato Institute?
No, it was published commercially, I think, by St. Martin's Press.
I believe so, yes.
It's a commercial publication. It's an excellent book, very well written. And he's absorbed all of the necessary material, and he kind of skewers these people, not just Paul Ehrlich, but also Stephen Schneider, Carl Sagan.
Yes.
Do you remember the nuclear winter scare?
Oh, yes, the nuclear winter scare. And then there's also, there were predictions about, well, first of all, I understand on the first Earth Day, they were concerned, the celebration of first Earth Day, they were concerned about global cooling.
Yes.
And they were predicting that the snow belt would go all the way down to Mexico and causing much devastation.
I will remember that. Atmospheric science is one of my specialties, and and I was also. The evidence looked that way. It was getting colder and colder in the world, and many of us thought maybe that's the next ice age coming. It's about due,
We're overdue, I understand.
Yeah, well, we don't. These things cannot be predicted accurately. But the warm period between ice ages should now be coming to an end. So we thought, well, it must be the ice age coming.
And now, using the same data, many of these people are talking about global warming.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting how the same people who professionally, you might say, interested in hyping the scientific evidence and in scaring the public simply shift their position and take whatever's available to support their new position.
Yes, and matter of fact, one paper I was reading, it was saying kind of tongue-in-cheek that if there's global warming, then it could indeed be a godsend, because we're overdue, or we're just about due for another ice age.
Yes, that's a possibility. But I don't see any evidence for global warming, in spite of the fact that the concentration of carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere. And from the simple theory, this should lead to some warming. But apparently the simple theory doesn't work.
It's not a general equilibrium theory.
It doesn't seem to describe the atmosphere properly. And I think we have to be somewhat humble about this and realize that nature is a little more complicated than our mathematical models.
And it strikes me as rather arrogant of mankind to think that he can make any significant parametric changes in the ecosystem. That is it is so large, and there's so many variables that are not in our control, and I just cannot see how we can make significant weather differences. It's almost like telling me, and I could be wrong about this, is that, well, if mankind tried hard enough, he could change the direction of the tides.
Well,
or he could change the flow of the Gulf Stream. You know?
I tend to be more cautious on this matter. My scientific training tells me that there might be pressure points where man's intervention could make a difference. So my general view is one of caution. One has to investigate each and every one of these problems separately and carefully. I never dismiss anything out of hand. But I must tell you that a lot of the problems that should have been dismissed out of hand by now, nevertheless, have been used or misused, and have been used to scare the public.
And also, I think, if I'm not being too cynical or too critical of many of those in the environmental movement, and that is, nobody can intellectually defend communism and socialism now. Because of its history and its collapse. And I get the feeling that people are substituting environmentalism as a means of control, because indeed almost everything in the environmentalist movement calls for management and control of people and their activities, very much like socialism. Accomplishes the same thing. You can get to the objective through environmentalism.
Yes, I've noticed that. Socialism and communism calls for the ownership of all of the productive resources by the state. The new paradigm of environmentalism seems to be we don't have to own them, we just have to control them, that's all.
That's right.
It amounts to the same thing, doesn't it?
That's right, absolutely. Now, another aspect of environmentalism and is a lot of times people are saying, well, the Earth is becoming too populated, becoming overpopulated, and we need measures to control population. And some places they say that countries are poor because they have too much population, and they again another government program to kind of manage things.
Well, the statistics don't bear that out, do they? I mean, was it Hong Kong has a higher density population than almost any other place in the world, and not doing too badly?
And it's the second richest political jurisdiction in Far East.
I think so. Singapore. I'm not sure which is richer. These judgments that people make, I guess, are too hasty, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would say. Matter of fact, they go beyond that. They don't make sense. Several years ago, a student made that comment in one of my classes, that the world is becoming, or United States is becoming overpopulated. We have, too many people on the given resources. So what I did, I went to the almanac, and I took the square acres in Texas. I subtracted out all the water in Texas.
Yes.
And I divided the American population into the total number of acres in Texas, and turned out that if you put every single American in Texas, each family of 4 would have almost 3 acres of land. The precise number is 2.8. and matter of fact, if you took Texas, California, and Alaska, you could put the entire world's population in those states, and each person would have 2/10 of an acre, which is far more than the people in Hong Kong have.
Well, it's an interesting question. I honestly don't know what limits there are to population growth. Land, food, it doesn't seem to be a limit. Some people 20 years ago, do you remember Limits to Growth?
Yes.
This weird publication that came out thought that we would run out of resources, metals, by the year 1990. The fact they had it mathematically figured out that right now we should have no more oil left, no more gold, no more silver. It would all be gone somehow. And of course they were really wrong about this. And I think discredited the science.
Or discredited the Malthusian doctrine.
Yes, certainly.
And we've been getting this message of running out of things for a long time, for 100 years or so. One time, people are saying, I believe in the 1920s, that we're going to run out of wood.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and we're going to run out of coal.
That was the timber shortage. You notice, by the way, that our government, the federal government, did not set up a Department of Lumber,
No.
Secretary of Lumber. But when they got worried about energy, immediately we had a Department of Energy and the Secretary of Energy.
That is absolutely right.
Yeah. So every time we have a crisis, we seem to set up a new government department.
Yes. I don't know. Well, I mean, environmental issues are important. The air we breathe, it's important. Our water is important. How should we go about it that differs from what we're doing today?
You know, we have actually accomplished a great deal in environmental cleanup. We have certainly over the last 20 years. I've been involved in this professionally, first in the Department of Interior and then in the Environmental Protection Agency, as you know. I didn't last very long in government, but at least I was there at the beginning and helped get a few things started. We accomplished a great deal. We have much cleaner water, much cleaner air now than we did 20 years ago. I must tell you that we have done it at great cost. Looking back on it, it could have been done with a lot less expenditure. But be this as it may, from now on, I don't believe that we are going to be getting our money's worth for the dollars we spend. In the beginning you can. It's easy to take care of the first increment of pollution. But after a while it becomes more and more difficult. You get into the point of diminishing returns. And in many of the areas we are way past the point of diminishing returns.
Yeah, and I understand that that there's technology available to help us with pollution problems, but it's not used. That would be much cheaper. I understand that there's a fellow at university, a university in Colorado. He's
University of Denver. Yes.
Denver. He's
Don Stedman.
Yes, a measure for why don't you mention that?
Well, I know him personally quite well, and we're colleagues. He's an outstanding chemist, and invented a system of measuring emissions of from automobiles by remote sensing, which is a very effective and very low-cost way of checking up on cars. But the bureaucracy has been resisting using his method for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into, but you obviously will understand that they feel threatened by this in some way.
And they make costly regulations. I understand that only what percentage of cars cause the pollution? There's some number like a very
small number. Less than 5% of the cars on the road now account for most of the pollution that we experience. These are called, some people call them the stinkers.
Right.
But these are cars that are not well maintained. And
so if you had this pollution device, you could detect those cars and impose penalties rather than passing laws
to make the other cars cleaner. You know, it doesn't make any sense to make the other cars cleaner as long as you leave these old ones on the road. And you cannot afford to retrofit them. It's just too expensive. What some people are doing, what Unocal, an oil company, is doing, is to actually buy them up and scrap them. So that's a very rather expensive way, but a clever way of getting them off the road. It may make sense in Los Angeles to do that. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, what do you think of the idea of imposing on the whole country a set of standards that is really developed to deal with the smog problem in Los Angeles?
I think it's ridiculous, and it's very costly. Los Angeles has some unique problems with what do they call air inversion?
Yes.
And
I don't think we'll ever be able to help them.
Oh, that's right.
No matter what we do.
But we impose those same regulations or similar regulations on parts of the country that don't have the kind of problems.
Why should North Dakota force its cars, the cars in North Dakota, to have the same emission controls that the cars in Los Angeles have? It doesn't make sense.
Well, it's kind of like, as you were talking, I was thinking, it's kind of like, here I have a house, and let's say I have a wife and a couple of kids, and one kid keeps his room like a pig pen.
We have one of those.
Yeah, right. and I'm trying to clean up his room by making my wife and daughter and the other kids keep their rooms cleaner.
Yes, that's a great analogy. I hope you'll let me use that one.
And it doesn't do any good instead of identifying him. And this is the same thing with cars, identifying the stinkers and imposing penalties or getting them repaired or getting them off the road.
Yes.
We're not being very smart about it. Plus and I think that one can make a case that we're losing, we're spending, if you spend resources over here unwisely, well, that means that those same resources can't be spent somewhere else. And there's a loss of life and loss of we don't have the health standards over here because we're unwisely using resources over there.
We come back to this. In fact, I brought this along. There was a study just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed that death rates, life expectancy, and is all linked to income. Mm-hmm. So if you take income from people, you rob them of years of life. Basically. Mm-hmm. That's what these people proved. These are people from the Federal National Center for Health Statistics. Mm-hmm. They did an analysis to show how quality of life, health, and life expectancy is related to income. Mm-hmm. And there's a very strong correlation. So by forcing people to waste money on environmental problems that are imaginary, that are phantoms, you really are hurting them in another way.
Possibly killing them.
Possibly, yes.
I mean, and so we might want to indict the Congress of the United States.
Yeah. There are some gross measures that one can use. I've been talking to Bruce Ames, a very distinguished biochemist at the University of California, and he keeps pointing out that if you look at life expectancy in the United States and see how it has generally improved over the last 50 years, at the same time, we have increased the number of chemicals, the amount of chemicals in the environment, and you would expect that if chemicals are responsible for cancer, you should have increases in cancer rates. You don't. Nothing like this has happened. On the contrary, people live longer. The only exception, of course, is tobacco and smoking, causing lung cancer. But that's well understood. But except for that, and none of these chemicals that are rampant in the environment that people are worried about, that we're spending billions of dollars on, seem to be causing any health effects in a gross sense.
And I think that it's dosage that plays a very, very important role on the effect of chemicals.
Of course.
And then also, the chemicals being used, they're killing something else that might have caused cancer. The fumigants for grains. I forget the name of
the methyl bromide.
Yeah, the methyl bromide.
Or the EDB, the whatever that stands for, ethyl dibromate. Yes.
But they're fungicides.
Yes.
In the grains, if we did not use these chemicals, we may indeed get increased cancer or increased morbidity from the
molds, from the natural molds. Yes, yes. Many people don't realize that there are natural things that kill us.
That's right.
That we have to fight them with chemicals.
Yes, as a matter of fact, there's this lady, Elizabeth Whalen of what is the American Council
for Science and Health.
Science and Health.
Yes.
She sent me out a Thanksgiving menu.
Yes.
Listing all the things that the average American would have for Thanksgiving, and she was listing all the known carcinogens in the foods.
These are natural carcinogens in the food, and the carcinogens, I put that in quotes, of course, as proven by the fact that if you feed near lethal doses of the stuff to rats, some of them develop tumors.
That's right. Even with turkeys, in turkey, there's a particular chemical that's cancer causing. But she was suggesting that you don't have to worry about it unless you ate. If you kept your consumption of turkey under 275 tons per sitting.
Yes, so the dose is really what makes the difference. There are many vegetables. Vegetables, by and large, contain natural pesticides because that's how vegetables protect themselves against predators, against insects.
That's right.
They're natural pesticides. And if you eat too much of it, you can get sick. If you eat tons and tons of broccoli, it'll hurt you.
That's right.
But there's not much danger of that.
And then even on the issue of tobacco, in my mind, tobacco even has to be a relatively mild carcinogen to the extent that it requires a person to consume, let's say, 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 45 years or more to get cancer. And also, I understand that they haven't even shown that tobacco causes cancer in mice or animals.
I think that the medical researchers accept the fact that the smoking, direct smoking, does
I go along with that.
lung cancer in susceptible individuals. Not everyone is susceptible.
Yeah.
Apparently, there are large individual differences. Obviously, the people who get lung cancer who never smoke, and the people who smoke all the
3
time
packs a day.
who never get lung cancer. One thing that interests me, and you may have some views on that, is this question of secondary smoke. You know, it's called environmental smoke.
Tobacco smoke,
yes.
ETS.
ETS. I think you've written something on that, haven't you?
Yes, I did. It was, the EPA is recently listed, or at least in early 1993, they listed ETS as a Class A or Grade A carcinogen, and which kind of prompted a number of agencies to make changes in regulations banning laws. Now, it's my understanding that this is fraudulent behavior on behalf of the ETA. That is, on all other studies, they've been using 95% level of confidence in their statistical analysis. And
what does that mean, 95%?
Well, only 5% could get it by chance, 5% chance.
Yes.
That the association between
so it's like
ETS.
95% sure that this is real.
Yes, right.
Normally.
And which is the acceptable scientific level of confidence.
Yes.
But in order to reach the conclusion that they reached that it was a Class A carcinogen, they had to lower the confidence interval down to 90%. And then plus they use meta-analysis, combining studies together. And indeed, there are some meta-analysis studies done with statistics, but it was invalid. These studies were not that comparable that you can combine them validly.
The last I read about it, the tobacco companies have taken EPA to court on this issue.
Yes. Yeah. And I think yes, they have. And I think that for a lot of, I agree with most Americans that cigarette smoke doesn't smell very nicely.
Yes.
But
I don't smoke myself. Don't like it.
But the issue is the issue is whether science can be perverted to accomplish certain public policies.
Exactly. Yes.
Whether we should allow that.
Yes.
And the cigarette smoking, what the EPA did with cigarette smoking, they've done the same thing with asbestos, and they've done the same thing with some other things, where radon.
Yes.
And kind of fudging with the numbers and unnecessarily alarming people.
Yeah. Well, this is of course what I'm personally involved in my project, the Science and Environmental Policy Project, which I started and which we're now running, is really concerned with the misuse of science. And we try to document how science is used or misused and make this information available, particularly to the press, hoping that they'll pick it up. And I must say that in the last year, we've seen a real turnaround in the press. And in such quality newspapers as the New York Times and the Washington Post.
They're becoming more suspicious of the...
Oh, yes. And journalists, I think, on the whole, quite honest, quite smart people, and they're beginning to realize that the environmental organizations that have been hyping many of these so-called threats have
an axe to grind.
Axe to grind, yes. Not the least of which is to keep their budgets up.
That's right. And are they going to reputable sciences more? Because I've seen surveys of reputable climatologists they've asked questions about global warming, and you cannot get a majority to say, yes, I think there is global warming. It's only a very, very small number.
Yes, I think the so-called majority only exists in the imagination of Vice President Al Gore, because he's claimed that 98% of scientists agree with his view. I don't know where he gets this number from.
Oh, my goodness.
It's not borne out by any of the surveys that have been made, including a survey by Greenpeace, by the way, which gives a result that would be very disappointing to him.
I see. Well,
But where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves us with many questions that are unanswered, and I just wish that you were, my colleague, back again at George Mason University so that we could resume this conversation. But there's always a chance in the future.
We can get together again, and I hope we will often, and keep discussing the subject. It's a very rich subject, and it deserves to be borne out in more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.